Hi, and welcome to the Credible broadcast. Today we're joined by Doug Fischer, General Counsel at Active and President of Safe Vapor. That's right, Vape Saver, yeah.
Vape Saver, yes.
Vape Saver.
Say that fast. Say that fast 10 times. Yeah.
I know. And then, of course, we have Brian Fitzpatrick, CEO of Credible. Big show today, guys.
Yeah, and what's amazing is we're going to spend probably 30 minutes or a little more with a lawyer, and none of you are going to get a bill.
No promises. No, just kidding.
No promises. There you go. Well, we've got a jam-packed schedule today. I've been really excited to talk to you, Doug, because this is absolutely on everybody's mind what just happened. And before we get into what happened, I know you're sort of a mission-driven guy and doing some great work out there. So if you could just give us a little bit of a background on yourself and what really brought you into the space, what's your personal journey and mission look like here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be quick because you're right. We got a lot of fun stuff to talk about, or maybe not so fun. But I'm a lawyer. I started my career not in the cannabis space. I was at a big corporate law firm, but I always knew I wanted something to do with this space. Cannabis has been a part of my life. I believe in the power of the plant. It's been a force for good in my life. And I've always believed that the arguments for policy reform were compelling. And I wanted to be a part of that. So over the years in my career at the big law firm, I sort of tried to develop a practice in this space in like 2013, 2014, as Colorado went legal and you started to see some change, and ultimately made the leap full-time into the space in 2017. Had been general counsel of a handful of businesses in the space. And really what drives me is solving problems, at an intellectual level and on a mission level. It's access to safe cannabis products. I truly, truly believe that people benefit from that. And I also truly believe that prohibition does more harm than good. That's the argument I think needs to be happened, not the absolute harms or benefits of anything. And so I've been fortunate enough to have a bunch of amazing experiences along that journey. Worked for a couple of ancillary companies, including Green Lane Holdings, which was the first business to IPO on a big board that was explicitly a cannabis business. Was general counsel of an MSO, Ascend Wellness Holdings, and now I'm general counsel of Active, which is a vertically integrated vaporization hardware company. So we make all the cartridges, pods, batteries, and products that cannabis oil is put into. And sell them throughout the industry. And I'm also fortunate enough to be the president of Vape Safer, which is the unified voice of the cannabis vaping industry. We're a 501c6 organization fighting for robust and safe cannabis vape market. That market is 25% roughly of the overall cannabis market. And the issues are complex and nuanced, and it needs its own voice. So that's why we're here.
So you know a thing or two about what we're about to talk about, and we sort of had this different script, but we're going to change it up a little bit because we have a lot to talk about here, specifically around the recently passed spending appropriations bill, whatever you want to call it, and specifically Section 759, which not many people understand what those sections are, but everybody in this industry understands what that is. So for our listeners. And Doug, as I told you before, many of our listeners are not just industry insiders, but they're folks that are really have an interest in this space and they want to learn more. And we provide that sort of plain language way of understanding what this industry is about. So at the risk of sort of being, talking about things that a lot of people understand in the industry, can you sort of take us back a little bit to sort of the Farm Bill of 2018 passed in 19 under the Trump administration, what it was, what it is, and where it's going, so we can understand what just happened, and we can talk about what just happened as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I think everybody knows, marijuana is illegal at the federal level. It's a Schedule I controlled substance under the Controlled Substances Act. And not to get too technical, but that was always defined in the law as the cannabis sativa L plant having more than 0.3% Delta 9 THC by dry weight. Mm-hmm. And the 2018 Farm Bill came along and removed from the definition of marijuana the hemp plant, right? And its extracts and derivatives. And so now, which by the way, same plant, right? It's still cannabis.
Right. Still cannabis, right?
Or it just has a lower THC amount, at the time of harvest.
Right.
And so what this did was allow people to grow hemp crops. And I think the intent behind it, most people recognize, was industrial hemp for all its applications, whether it's hempcrete or feed for animals or rope or textiles or any of that. But American ingenuity being what it is, people realized how to take these plants that were less than 0.3% THC, and either through extraction through natural processes or chemical conversion, create Delta-9 THC, which is the THC that people generally refer to and the one that gives you the high for marijuana, as well as a number of other intoxicating cannabinoids. And since that bill, there's been a proliferation of intoxicating products containing cannabinoids derived from hemp. And, in some forms, that's the beverages that have really gained a lot of, sort of accelerated normalization that you might see depending on your state in Total Wine, or you might be able to get them at a bar in certain states. And then it also has included some completely novel cannabinoids that were synthesized in a lab that don't occur naturally in the plant, that make their way into edibles and vapes that you can buy in convenience stores and gas stations and places like that have very little age gating. And so it really probably unintentionally opened up this entire market of intoxicating products outside of what was the state regulated marijuana system, where everyone has licenses and there's product testing and marketing rules and things of that nature. And so that kind of brings us up until a few days ago.
And a few days ago, it was a spending or appropriations bill that let's call it a sneak attack on hemp, because it was sort of, to me, I call it a sneak attack because it was sort of tucked in here on an appropriations bill, which is essentially, and we can argue about whether it is a hemp ban or whether it's a severe limitation. But I think the intentions were to get rid of some of those things that you talked about, the HHC, the Delta-8, sort of those synthetic causes, the gas station CBD, if you will, that, they like to hold up that looks like a bag of Skittles, which, those things, the alphabet of THC, the intention was to get rid of those, but it became much too far reaching. And I want to talk about what it is now, because, and then I want to talk about sort of, I thought there was rules in the House and the Senate about how you pass massive legislation in an ombudsman, or in a appropriation or spending bill. I mean, obviously nobody was sitting around saying, hey, let's drag out the government closure to talk about hemp. There was a movement, there was a need to get the government back open. But that's why I call it it was almost like a sneak attack or being held hostage, this bill, to get it signed, because I've noticed there were some people that support hemp that voted, for this bill, this restricted bill, because it was important to get the government open. So first, let's talk about what happened. What does the bill say?
Yeah, so the bill says a number of things. But it changes the definition of hemp from the 2018 Farm Bill is the big takeaway. And it changes it in a couple of ways. It basically removes, and I'll get into the details of how, all of the sort of intoxicating, it does it in some more technical ways, but all the intoxicating products we're just talking about, whether they be beverages, vapes, edibles, are not more or less, they're not allowed anymore, right? And it basically said, okay, first of all, we're counting total THC, not just Delta-9 THC. So whereas previously it was, hey, you could have a plant with less than 0.3% Delta-9 THC, but it had THCA, which is a precursor to Delta-9 THC. If it's heated, it converts to Delta-9 THC. And it said, okay, that we're now counting the 0.3 all THC. So a bunch of plants and extracts and stuff that included other forms of THC are now no longer included in the definition of hemp, and therefore Schedule 1 controlled substances. They're treated as marijuana. And then it said, hey, you've got intermediate products. So the isolates and the distillates and the extracts that go into your beverages and edibles. And it said, if any of those have greater than that 0.3% of THC, any type of THC, or contain any synthetic cannabinoids, those are not allowed. And then it did a third thing, and it said, and when it comes to finished products, meaning something that a consumer would get, like a can of a hemp seltzer, for example, if it has more than 0.4 milligrams of THC, again, any type of THC per container, then that is also not allowed. And so those three provisions combined more or less take off the market pretty much every product that was being made out of hemp. In the language, yeah, you could find some ways to make products that are viable, but in reality, those aren't the products that are in the market.
Yeah, and some question whether this was even kosher, since the House and the Senate have rules that theoretically prohibit substantive changes to laws in appropriations bills. So in other words, passing legislation or legislative provisions in spending bills, to try to keep them separate from authorizations in permanent law. Now, in reality, we know that this gets used all the time, right? They're routinely waived or ignored or defeated by procedural loopholes. And, basically once it reaches the president's desk and it gets signed, then, it's kind of too late. But I know there's going to be arguments around that. So, because the question is, is it even feasible or kosher that they were able to pass something this big in a spending appropriations bill?
Yeah, there will. And I'm not a parliamentarian. I don't pretend to know all the ins and outs, but I think we have to deal with the hand we're being dealt right now. I think the odds of a successful legal challenge in that regard are slim to none. I wouldn't hang my hat on that, because there's other examples of this in completely unrelated industries. And it's interesting. I agree this came about very quickly, and your word sneak attack is interesting, because on the one hand, yeah, there were some lobbying interests, alcohol being one of them, that got this inserted into the bill at the last second. But on the other hand, it's been building for a while, right? Just a few weeks ago, 39 states attorneys generals wrote a letter to Congress saying, I'm seeing this Delta 8 and this HHC in gas stations, please stop it. And there's been regulated cannabis operators with, mixed motives saying, hey, we're in these regulated systems and hemp derived products are not. You've got to do something about it. So, and then there's been bad actors, and I don't paint with a broad brush, because there's certainly plenty of great actors in the hemp space too, who haven't helped their cause. You mentioned like a bag that looks like Skittles, right? You see, they tried to ban it in Texas, and you've got the governor standing up there, the lieutenant governor standing up there showing these products. So it happened quickly, but it's been building slowly for a long time, because, you just ended up with this unregulated market of intoxicants. At some point, you got to assume the government's going to do something about that, whether you agree with it or not.
Yeah, and that's why I called it a sneak attack, because we all knew it was building, but everybody thought that there was time to sort of make some change. And speaking about time, there is a built-in 365-day grace period, right, before this new law actually takes effect. So it does, provide some time for industry, folks to file lawsuits and seek injunctions, right? And by the way, I do agree with you that there's, some bad apples spoiled the bunch, right? Because but it's sort of frustrating when you got the lieutenant governor of Texas holding up a bag of Skittles, making it look like that's the entire industry. It's not the entire industry. It was a subset of what came out of it, which was not good. I mean, we've seen that in every industry. I saw it in the mortgage industry, where, a handful of bad actors didn't do what they were supposed to do, and it created lots of issues. So, and by the way, just like I said in the mortgage industry, that the pendulum's going to swing if you don't get your stuff together. I've been saying it in this industry since 2018, guys. Be careful, because you're going to, all of a sudden, the pendulum's going to swing, knock everybody over, and you're going to ruin a good thing. So, and we saw that happen here, but we do have, for the sake of the benefit of this good industry and the good producers, there's a lot of them out there. We've worked with a lot of them. We have time. So do you think is going to happen in this time frame? What are the likely sort of programs or things that are going, or even compromises that you think could happen here? Because some people are talking about a 2026 farm bill.
Yep.
Now, I always am cautious about that because I've seen every farm bill over the last several years get kicked down the road, and it never really happens. So, I don't know if I'm that hopeful of a 2026 farm bill, but there is hope there. But what else? I mean, what else could happen here?
Yeah. Well, why don't I start with what I think should happen, and then because I'm no expert on, I can't read the future, but I think if you want to find a silver lining in this, there's a couple actually. I think one is you had a lot of groups that were at odds with each other for understandable reasons, and their lack of cooperation or even adversarial nature hurt it. So you have regulated cannabis and marijuana who've gone through an arduous process to get state licenses, build facilities that can only be sold in dispensaries, lab testing, all these things that are generally good, but expensive and make it hard to compete. And then all of a sudden you had this almost unregulated hemp industry pop up alongside of it. And so while they're working with the same plant, you've got an overregulated state marijuana industry that's saying this isn't fair at all. And you've got a potentially underregulated hemp industry saying, hey, we're going to do what we want to do. And some of them act responsibly because they're good actors and some of them don't. And so the path to reform was challenging because most of the hemp actors more or less wanted the status quo, except to enshrine it and make it more public. And some of them wanted some regulations that made sense, like age gating and these sorts of things, which I fully agree with. But you had, marijuana actors that wanted nothing to do with it. And then you've got sort of outside interests, I'll call them, like alcohol and pharma and everybody else, who's each got their own little take on it, right? Now, it's all marijuana, right? It's all back to the status quo. All of it is a Schedule I controlled substance. And so there's a real incentive for everyone to kind of set aside their narrower interests and realize that, hey, if we don't create a path to safe access for cannabinoid products, let's set the plan aside, we're all going to be in a world of hurt here, right? And it's interesting because that last provision that we talked about in the bill that said, you can have up to 0.4 milligrams of THC per container of a product. That's fascinating because that's the first time that I'm aware of that a federal piece of legislation has really, one, legislated by cannabinoid, not by the plant that it comes from, which I think is the logical path forward. And two, actually said that including some amount of a Schedule I controlled substance is permissible. And not just, and that last thing is interesting because it's contrary to the Controlled Substances Act. And it's also contrary to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, right? Which is a whole other ground by which you could say most of the hemp products were not legal. Certainly a different type of legal violation, but that was always sort of the argument as to, well, is hemp products really legal? Well, no, they're all adulterated if you look at it under that thing. So what I would like to see happen is, the marijuana and hemp industries come together and align on some regulatory pillars that make sense. Things like truth in labeling, preventing youth access, and certain safety standards. And use that as a basis to say, hey, if you're okay with some amount of THC, Congress, why don't we take that off the schedule? We can leave the more dangerous or potentially dangerous synthetic cannabinoids on the schedule, or place them on the schedule, I should say, and then create one or more regulatory paths, whether they be pharma, beverage, or otherwise, for the cannabinoids that aren't scheduled. So there's a more logical path forward now that everyone's kind of starting from the same position. That's obviously my optimistic view. There will still be people, of course, who pursue their more narrow interests.
Yeah, and I could see that, and that you're right. There's some pretty interesting implications where now we're talking about a cannabinoid, not necessarily a plant. But the limitation is just, first of all, I was involved in an investment of a large hemp grow in Kentucky years ago, and 100 and something farms. And I can tell you it was a very hot year that year, and it's almost impossible to grow hemp at 0.3% because THC spikes in heat. And the farmers did everything they could do to control it. And that year, the Kentucky Department of Agriculture didn't even test at harvest because they knew the whole state would be on fire, right? They'd have to burn
Yeah.
everything. So first of all, it's really hard to grow and control that. There are methods to remediate THC in the extraction process once it comes out, but those amounts arguably are just way, 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 way too low. And I know that there's some proposals to increase them. I know that's something Rand Paul was trying to look at, and Senator Wyden had some interesting bills around that as well. But ultimately, nobody listened to them at the end of the day. So this is, and you talked about sort of these two different industries, one regulated, one really not regulated. Both industries are misregulated from my perspective.
Agreed on that. Yeah.
And they just need, they both need better regulations. But, so lawsuits at a federal level haven't really been effective over the years. So, but there's going to be some lawsuits. I'm sure we're going to be seeing this, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Because
and I think go ahead.
Because when you're talking about this all of a sudden, you're tripping over now a Schedule I drug. Okay. That has an implication of 280E, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. All the hemp businesses, if they continue to operate as, will be subject to that 100%. That's right.
Absolutely. So now, you've got hemp businesses and CBD businesses now potentially subject, to this. But, I've heard a couple of other implications of some likely scenarios as well. And again, I don't think legal and injunctions are going to get very far, right? But we're going into sort of the midterms, right, in 2026. So some people say that's a good thing, and some people say that's not a good thing. That's a bad thing, right, for actually getting something done. Why are they saying it's a bad thing? They're saying it's a bad thing because even though we have 365 days, it shortens that, significantly because of the midterm elections, and nothing productive is going to get done because we don't have a full 365. So, I mean, do you agree with that?
It creates a challenge and an opportunity. I completely agree with the shortened schedule. The flip side of that is money talks, right? And not in the way that I think some observers think so, right? It takes a handful of legislators really pushing an issue to get it. And if you have some vulnerable legislators in states with hemp industries or marijuana industries, and you can organize and say, hey, get behind this universal cannabinoid regulation bill, something along, I like that you referenced Senator Wyden's CSRA, something along the lines of that. If you can get behind that, then we'll support you. And if not, we've got a war chest and a pack of however many millions of dollars that we're going to spend on your opponent. Because I think, to date, both industries, and particularly the marijuana industry, less so the hemp, have sort of overestimated their importance on the Hill, right? They're there and they're active, but no one vote. Like, it's great that 70% of people support legalization in a poll. But the real question is how many people vote on it. That's what the politicians care about, or they care about you supporting their opponents, right? And so, yeah, it's a shortened schedule. The flip side is if you've got some vulnerable people politicians whose support could push sensible regulation across the line, you could actually create a scenario where they're motivated to do that, and they can call it a win. And I think even so for the administration, not taking any positions on this administration or however anyone feels about them, but any presidential administration wants a win, and doing something that seems common sense to 70% of Americans, granting some form of access to safe and tested and accurately labeled products is a win. And it's a win that they can hopefully carry, to protect some of their seats. And so that's another lever we can pull on.
Well, here's I want to address something you said. You said money talks. I want to address that in a second. But before I do that, one of the things that I'm thinking, and maybe it's just the naivety of my mind about this, because I don't spend a lot of time in Washington, praise God. But the issue here is, I almost picture these folks who were very supportive of hemp, being talked to and said, listen, just vote against this because we got to get the government open. We'll come back and readdress this later. Okay. But we can't sit here and talk about hemp for the next, week and a half while people are suffering. That sort of makes sense to me. I mean, I wonder how much of that went on. I mean, that's just a kind of a thought that I've been thinking about, right? Just to get the government reopened. That's why I called it sort of a hostage situation.
Yeah, I agree.
It was what it was. And then, but you said money, money talks, there's kind of power in the money. There's been some powerful lobbyists lobbying against, the hemp industry. And you mentioned alcohol, you mentioned cannabis. What about pharma?
I've always believed that argument to be a little overblown. I understand there's this sort of tension between plant medicine and natural remedies and big pharma. And certainly there's some of that ethos in the cannabis industry, but there isn't a whole lot of evidence that pharma's been really tamping down cannabis reform. I think there's been enough self-inflicted wounds, whether it be the gas station, HHC and all this, or even in the regulated market, some companies that really skirt the line in terms of who they're marketing to, that I don't think they've had to do that much. And I also think whatever cannabis is eating into it's a drop in the bucket for the Eli Lillys and the Pfizers of the world, right? I've heard that, and I certainly think that if there's a rescheduling situation, there will be active in drug development. But ultimately what we need, and I think what most people want all around, is multiple pathways, right? There should be a medical pathway. And you've seen that, right? There's Epidiolex and Sativex and all these drugs that have gone through FDA testings and are approved. And that makes sense, but you can have a pathway for that and also a pathway where it's available commercially. It would be a new thing that hasn't happened. I can't think of an analog in terms of other products that have worked that way, but the market's developed in such a way that I don't think that's unrealistic either. And even then within the products, you could see a different pathway for, let's say, beverage versus the rest of the products, right? And this is part of, I think you mentioned compromises earlier, right? I think this is one of the things where if actors are smart and work together, you could make some really sensible compromises. So, state legal marijuana businesses want everything through the dispensary channel. Fine. But if they're going to say it's all or nothing, they're going to be in a world of hurt. Instead, what if they say, okay, fine, beverages with less than 5 milligrams of THC per can can be derived from anywhere. We just care about how much THC is in it, and you can sell those outside the dispensary channel. And now all of a sudden, the liquor wholesalers and distributors aren't opposed to this. In fact, they're in favor of it, and you've broadened your coalition. And so there are compromises, I think, that can really get more access for more people to safe products and still more or less preserve everyone's business interests, maybe narrow harms to them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And by the way, we're gonna continue past our normal 30-minute broadcast because we have some more things to cover. And thank you, Doug, for hanging in there with us for a little longer. We appreciate your time and certainly your expertise. And for our listening audience, if there's any questions you want to ask, we'll try to open up if we can to a couple questions towards the end. But I want to sort of double click on something that I mentioned earlier. Is there a chance that Congress may revisit the language during the upcoming Farm Bill renewal and actually do something under this administration in a revisitation of the Farm Bill?
Yes. Short answer, yes. I think there has to be, and I'm already seeing a push for it. I'm encouraged. The number of phone calls I've received in the past 2 days, 3 days of, can we form this coalition? Can we form that coalition? I'm looking online, and all of a sudden all sorts of different groups are popping up, and it's going to take some time for everything to coalesce. But yeah, I think that's possible. It's a tall order. To your point, it's already 1 year's not that long in legislative process anyway. And then in a midterm year, it's even shorter. But I do think that's possible because I think there are enough politicians that will see it as a win and enough businesses that understand this is now or never. It's a survivor. People who I've known to more or less sit on the sidelines and tend their business, even those people I've seen start getting extremely active in the past few days. And I have to believe that momentum is going to continue.
That's good. I feel the same way, even though I have been pessimistic in the past about farm bills. I mean, look, Trump passed a farm bill before. He moved it in 2019 for the 2018 passage of it. So, let's hope. I think that's that's a good hope, because that's where it belongs. And the other key things is sort of regulatory clarification and flexibility. So, the FDA and the Health and Human Services Department have regulatory discretion, let's say, in defining, and you're a lawyer, so you love words, and so do I. That counts, what counts as quantifiable, or what counts as intoxicating, right? Now they've defined it in sort of numbers, but if the agencies actually look at science-based thresholds, do we think we have a chance at really, even in the Farm Bill, setting more practical, attainable limits that enable the survival of some of these products? Like, you look at a full spectrum tincture. I mean, you might as well call it broad spectrum under the new program, because there's going to be no such thing as full spectrum. It's going to be such a small trace amount, and that opens up, by the way, of zero THC with this whole RICO case that came down. That's a whole nother episode.
Yeah, right. We'll talk about that next time.
And we got to have you back to talk about that one. But I mean, I think that when you look at some of these terminologies of quantifiable and intoxicating, I think is there chance that they could sort of, in the definition, or do you think we're going to focus purely on just the numbers?
I hope it's actually something. I think it's definitional, but I want to go back to what the story you told about the hot hemp in Kentucky, because I think that illustrates the answer to your question here. And it's where I started too, which is, let's regulate the cannabinoids, not a plant. There's no reason for cannabis sativa L to be on the controlled substances schedule. Mm-hmm. What should be on the controlled substances schedule is whatever cannabinoids are appropriate to be there. And it really shouldn't matter where they come from, right? We're talking about the same thing that's going into your body. If Delta 8, just as an example, is harmful, put it on Schedule 1. It's high potential for abuse, put it on Schedule 1. I think we can all agree that Delta 9 THC belongs nowhere on Schedule 1. It has clear medical uses, and the potential for abuse is not high. And so what I would like to see happen is not create this situation where farmers have to worry about exactly what the plant they're growing does, but instead we talk about what's taken out of that plant when it's entered into the stream of the commerce as either an intermediate product, an isolated distillate or some other form, or a final consumer product, because that allows the precision. And then the definitions are not as challenging, right? Now we're not talking about what's intoxicating. We're talking about, is it this molecule or is it that molecule? This molecule okay, this molecule okay in the following circumstances, this molecule not okay. And that makes a heck of a lot more sense. And it's also much more consistent with how we regulate food, beverage, and drugs anyway.
That makes just so much sense. That's a really good common sense approach to it. I really like that. We got to get you into Washington,
I used to be in Washington. I left. The common sense, I think, was my enemy.
And you went back to Colorado? Is that where? Well, Hickenlooper's a Colorado guy, and I know he's a big supporter of hemp, and he's got some. I've actually met John Hickenlooper before, and had these kind of conversations, and and he's one of the supporters, because he basically has seen the positive side of this, but we got to get rid of the negative side of it. And I want to talk about sort of because how do we sort of trigger the advocacy here, because we could really see some significant public backlash here, because we're talking massive economic downturn here. I mean, this could really hurt. So, I mean, I always believe that industries survive. They find new ways of pivoting, and they create new products and everything, but we got to give them more leeway. So what do we do in the meantime? How do we trigger advocacy? How can people help? How can we make this work?
Yeah, I think it has to come from a number of directions. And one of them was where I started, which is access, right? Part of the reason, not the entire reason, that the intoxicating hemp market blew up so quickly, and that there was so many opportunities for not just the responsible actors, but for the not so responsible actors, was that there was a lack of access to cannabis products. And those are compelling stories. There are people who need these products,
Yes.
or people who use them as an alternative to other potentially more harmful products, and other people who use them responsibly. And, you can speak in terms of businesses, economic interests, but that doesn't get you very far in Washington, nor should it really. There has to be a real world impact. And so I think the jobs impact is a real one, but I would start with the stories of people who actually need access to cannabis and who doesn't. And by the way, one of the other things that happened in the bill was stripping the veterans access, right? Which was extremely problematic. And what better spokesman for safe access than our heroes who use these products for whatever ill effects they've had from their service. And so there's a story to be told that I think needs to get louder and louder about access. And then the other is, it is economic, but not in the interest of these businesses. No one cares what businesses rise and fall except the people in those businesses. But what people do care about is the American economy, jobs, and growth and innovation. And this is a new homegrown industry that is less dependent upon foreign influences than the vast majority of industries in this country. And there's a real, again, not taking any political position, but if you have an administration that constantly uses the words America first, well, I'm hard pressed to think of a more American industry than cannabis and hemp.
Amen. And I think, it's important to understand that before this recent hostage situation vote, there's been several prominent politicians from both parties that have actively supported a modified hemp legislation. I mean, this has been a bipartisan thing. I mean, far more Democrats, obviously, than Republicans. But I urge the Republicans to understand that this, what's important here. But this is a bipartisan issue. And we know that Senator Rand Paul is a Republican out of Kentucky. I mean, he introduced the Hemp Act and, raising the limit to 1%. Ron Wyden, who's a Democrat out of Oregon, who's chief architect of the 2018 Farm Bill, has some great ideas. And, and I know even here in the state of New Jersey, Senator Cory Booker, and in Colorado, John Hickenlooper, Michael Bennett of Colorado, we got Martin Heinrich of New Mexico, they all signed a letter. And it was back, I think, in September of 2025, because we knew this was coming. You said that earlier. We knew this was coming, right? This has been talked about before. So it shouldn't be a surprise, but it was a surprise when we got taken hostage. So it signed a letter in September 2025 that called for hemp regulations that protects consumers without destroying the industry, right? And I think that's the goal here, right? We protect consumers. We put something that's science-based, that makes sense, that as you said, common sense approach to the actual cannabinoids that protects consumers and gives people access to products they need. Because let's face it, folks. Let's take the state of New Jersey. I think there's 135 licensed dispensaries in the state for a very large populated state. But also, not everybody's looking for a lot of THC.
That's right.
And we got to keep that in mind because, I know people very close to me who have used these products, full spectrum CBD products, to help them with focus, concentration, with symptoms of epilepsy and seizure disorders and all sorts of things, and ADD, that are natural remedies. And we cannot ignore the wellness aspects and the access to that. So folks, I urge you to do your research, get involved, because there is a significant bipartisan faction that favors this practical reform, and we need to see this happen. And, the other thing
that I add one more to what you're saying with the advocacy too, I think there's a big state role to play with this too. So I love that you're focusing on these states because when you look at the marijuana side of things, states have led the way. And the reason that the federal government has more or less been hands off with the marijuana industry is because states have put in rules. And now with the new definition of hemp, all these states are going to have to reopen their hemp legislation. Yes. And it's a real opportunity to adopt the same type, maybe more effective, not so overbearing, but the same types of protections that can do one of two things. They can either inform federal legislation, or they can get the federal government to say, oh, why don't we respect states' rights on this? If states want to ban it, they can, I suppose. Not that I favor this outcome, but at least it's more permissible at the federal level. But it can get them to look at this at a more states' rights level, like they have with the marijuana issue for the past, 12 years or however many it's been. And so when we talk about access and advocacy and where to start, there's a ton of work to be done at the state level too. And I think that's equally important and might be even a better starting place for a lot of people.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And by the way, I think that the states need to get their stuff together overall in both cannabis and hemp. And it's very, very important to really understand it. And it's very easy to get emotional when you hold up a bag of Skittles and you think that the entire industry was based off of 14-year-olds, sitting behind a dumpster getting wasted. That's really that's a bad look. Okay.
Yeah.
We don't want that. We do want to protect our children, but that's not what this industry is about. Okay. Let's get rid of the harmful side. Let's focus on what truly matters in this industry. And I've been studying and talking to a lot of politicians. I've talked to both on the D and the R side. This week, I've spoken to 2 senators. And part of what I'm trying to do is to educate them, to say, and literally with one of them, I created, and I won't tell you which state, but I literally wrote, and I'm not a legislator, but I created these ideas and put them in a bill format. And I sent them and said, what about this? Right? I mean, think about it. I mean, I'm just one guy and not making a huge difference. But if we all speak up, if we all get involved, we can all make a difference. And I think that's important. And the last thing I really want to talk about here is, the days of compliance theater, it's over. We're not talking about just what's happening here on the regulatory side, but we're also talking about here on the legal side. And again, we can have a whole nother issue. I wrote an article this week, which you can find at credible.com. I have a new series called Fits on Life. And I talk about my days back in the mortgage industry, of how the mortgage industry used the False Claims Act, okay, and resurrected that in 2018 to go after bad actors. Okay, we just saw that happen now with this latest legislation. It was medical marijuana against I forget the name of the individual, but it was a truck driver who basically was sold at a medical marijuana dispensary a product that contained no THC. Well, he failed the drug test, lost his job, sued. And now it came up under, so not only did the court specifically reject the argument that RICO only covers direct business or property injury, they doubled down on it. So job loss is due to ingesting a mislabeled CBD product. So folks, we're now looking about an industry that is now actionable under civil RICO. So we're now looking at a situation where we've got regulation to deal with, and we also have criminal liability and civil liability. So it's a very serious time. And I think that the need for compliance, the need to focus on accuracy of testing and labeling and truth in marketing and advertising, these are all very, very important things. So not sure how you feel about it, but I know you feel strongly because you're the general counsel of a pretty significant brand. So.
Yeah, no, I agree completely with that. And I love the term compliance theater. And it's funny, I used to talk about that in my prior life as well, because I did all sorts of accounting and defended all sorts of accounting fraud cases and insider trading cases. And I used to always say things like, if it's almost worse to have some fancy SOP or policy that you have no records of following than to not have one at all, right? And I agree with you. And, I fear, so it's interesting, right? In a world where the regulators and the enforcement arm of the government have insufficient resources, plaintiffs' lawyers become de facto regulators. And that's a much worse place to be, because they don't have a mandate to protect public health and safety. They have a mandate to make as much money as they can. Mm-hmm. And I would much rather see, companies be proactive about their compliance and regulators be sharp with their enforcement where it's warranted, not be overbroad, to stem that off, right? Because every company, whether they've done something right or wrong, is going to have to deal with these plaintiffs' lawyers if that proliferates. If there's effective enforcement and more or less widespread compliance, it's not a target. Plaintiffs' lawyers are going to focus elsewhere, whether it's, suing people over text messages they weren't consented to or whatever other, scheme they can come up with next, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's critical. So now, in the wake of both the Supreme Court RICO ruling and that was, I want to say, Horn, medical marijuana versus Horn. I think that's right.
Yeah.
So, and folks, check that out, because that just got handed down. So, in the wake of both the Supreme Court's RICO decision and the new federal hemp regulations, which include now these strict THC definitions, which I'm confident. I'm sorry, but I'm confident, and you're sort of like me, cautiously optimistic that there's going to be some good changes here that are going to put us in a better place. But it doesn't mean, that we can continue with compliance theater. Mere performative compliance or box checking is now the peril and the downfall of a company.
And not just from a direct enforcement standpoint either, right? It's, if you want to walk into your representative's office or your senator's office or your state legislator's office, but there's something in your Google history that says, oh, their COAs were inaccurate or their labeling was inaccurate. Guess what? You don't have a seat at the table, nor do you deserve one.
Yeah.
And
thank you. I 1,000%. You said it.
So now is the time, and we started out with bad apple spoil the bunch. I mean, now is the time to, for good actors to band together on it. And I've said, and this is what, maybe me being just too optimistic and hopeful, like something along the lines of good actors are defined by the standards they uphold, not which plant they get their cannabinoids from, right? And I would just like to see everyone adopt that ethos at this point. Whatever feelings you may have about the past, like, we'll all benefit if that's the mindset.
That's so true. And it's really incumbent on everybody in this industry to really get it right. And I remember walking into one company a couple of years ago, and I said, so you guys have SOPs, and they grabbed a binder off a shelf and literally blew the dust off it. And I mean, it was like, whew, and it was just amazing because, now these SOPs, they've got to be real. They've got to be actionable, and they have to be put into practice. So you don't have a seat at the table to talk about things about quality, consistency, and the future of this industry if you're not doing the right things, because the regulatory changes now give federal agencies, state regulators, private actors, literally plaintiffs' attorneys, the tools to bring consequential litigation. And now it's not just about the naughty letter we get from FDA once in a while that they appear. Now there's real fines, fees, and penalties. So not to scare everybody, because I think we're heading in the right direction. And I think we need to fix this industry and use the opportunities of this legislation to get it right. Faith, do we have any questions?
Yes, I wanted to get just a few in before we end the broadcast. So this question was submitted on LinkedIn. It says the entire medical and recreational cannabis industries were built with cannabis being a Schedule I drug. I don't see states that have regulated hemp and CBD changing what they've already established. How do you see this being enforced with the federal government lacking the manpower and money to execute nationwide enforcement?
Good question.
That's the $64,000. Great question. Well, I think it's a couple ways. I think, one, you're right. Enforcement will be at best spotty and uneven. There's way too many actors for this. So one, it's what Brian was just talking about with private enforcement. And it's not just civil RICO. There's been, for several years now, a trend of states adopting more permissive deceptive advertising or deceptive trade practices laws. And those have been used against some of the most prominent brands on the marijuana and the hemp sides. So there's that. I also think what you might end up seeing is more enforcement under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act for these products being adulterated. That's civil actions. It requires a lot less manpower to do it. And I also think you don't have to enforce against everyone to make a dent. You find the choke points. And to me, the choke points are really the retail outlets and the distributors. So, all it takes is a few convenience stores and gas stations and smoke shops. These are small businesses. They can't withstand a $50,000 fine or a $100,000 fine. You do 100 of those actions, now all of a sudden demand for those businesses to carry these products plummets. So I think that's a great and very good observation in that question, in that there's not just going to be an onslaught of federal enforcement, but there are smart targeted things they can do that will really harm the market.
Absolutely. And they will get targeted. So it might not be widespread at first, but it might be deep. And that's really sort of the issue. And the way they did that in the mortgage industry, by the way, is they pick certain examples, one out of each bunch, and they whacked them over the head really hard. I can remember the CFPB hitting one of our customers for $150 million. And I can remember one of those companies having to create a payment plan with the federal government. So, look, it happens because they want to make examples. So even though they might not have this widespread ability to enforce, they'll have enough enforcement action that people will feel it, see it. And, you just got to hit a few for people to get the notice. So that was a great question.
And the one thing I'd add also is, there's been a lot of headlines in the last few months alone. Target's picking up THC beverages. Circle K is picking up. I just saw it in Circle K like the other week when I was taking a road trip. And Total Wine, right? Certainly the big box retailers are not going to be carrying illegal products, which again makes the economics of the business entirely, and it's a huge hit to the market. So even without direct enforcement, the illegality will have a negative impact.
Absolutely. Faith, what else we have?
Okay, so this question was submitted on YouTube. A lot about unification. What do you feel it is going to take for a solution that will create a standard for safe, consumable hemp?
Well, I can take a shot at that. First of all, we got to get the legislation right. Okay. So it all starts with the legislation, but we can't talk about legislation without standards. So once legislation is defined, there has to be an agreement on creating standards. And what I've always hoped for in the cannabis industry is that there would be a federal standard, or at least a standard that can be enacted in multiple states that don't make it this patchwork or this of craziness that becomes very, very difficult to sort of uphold. And I think the ASTM has been doing great work in this area. And, I spend a lot of time talking to Dave Valancourt about these types of things and the work that he's been doing, and a great team over there at ASTM. I would say get involved in those things. You got to get involved in not only getting the legislation right, but also driving the right standards from a quality and safety perspective. Do you think I answered that right, Doug, or do you think you want to add?
Yeah, I agree, and I would just add on to it, but I totally agree. And shout out Dave, he's awesome, and
he really is.
Part of the D37 Committee on Cannabis, as are most of the members of Vape Safer. The other thing I'd add is just sort of aligning on what are the most important pillars in which we need these standards, right? What are the things that truly move the needle on public health and safety? We've talked about them, and I think they're fairly common sense. It's nothing that appeals to children or can get in children's hands. It's accuracy, right? What the product says it is what it actually is. It's not, and I think you pick, somewhere between 2 and 5 pillars as to what makes a safe product an important thing, and work on the standards within those, because it's very easy to go down a rabbit hole of you can use this material or this tolerance of parts, and that needs to be done. And that's the work AS doing, and that's the work that'll come in enabling regulations from the FDA or whoever the regulatory body is. But I think it's also a focusing of where you're doing that work.
Absolutely. And folks, I really believe like regulation and standardization, they've got to work hand in hand. It's so important. And if you're going to be part of the solution, then get part of the solution, become part of ASTM, become part of this advocacy, and get involved, because this is an opportunity. This is an absolute opportunity to make this industry better and to really work on the right standards and the right legislation. Anything else, Faith, that we want to cover?
There's a few other questions that are kind of very similar to the last one I asked you. So I think with the remaining time, if you guys want to finish it out, and then we can tell you what's up for next week.
That's my producer's way of saying wrap it up. And I want to thank Faith and the marketing team at Credible. Faith does a great job as being the producer here of Credible Live, and thank you so much for the great work you do. And Doug, thanks so much for being on the show today and extending your time. I do have a tremendous respect for what you're doing, the knowledge that you bring to the industry, and certainly for your time. So thank you very much. And I want to give you the opportunity to talk about your business and how folks can learn more about you.
Thank you so much. And first, thanks for having me. This is fun. I talk about this stuff all day. I would do it for free. I'm glad I don't have to, but I would anyway. But thank you. If you want to learn more about Active, the vape hardware company, go to active710.com and check out Singular. That's our new platform, totally renewable, much more environmentally friendly. If you're interested in getting involved with Vape Safer, it's vapesafer.org. And if you want to get in touch with me personally, you can email Doug at dougfisherlaw.com.
That's awesome. And Doug, thank you so much. This has been a phenomenal conversation, and we covered a lot of ground, and I think we covered it in a good way that answers a lot of questions and quite frankly gives hope to the industry, because there should be hope, so, keep up the good fight, everybody. Hang in there. We're going to get through this, and together we can make a better industry. So, Faith, who do we have coming up next on Credible Live?
Doug, it was so great to have you. I actually really enjoyed doing our pre-interview, and this interview was so informative. I really appreciate you taking the time. Next week, we have Christian Rasmussen. He is the #1 mushroom importer in the United States. So that'll be a really interesting conversation with him.
All right. And by the way, tune into that, because here's what I believe. I really believe that these natural products are really important. And I think we're going to see more innovation around cannabinoid, type products with, mushroom type products and things that could really accelerate wellness. So I think this is an opportunity also for new product innovation. And there's some great companies out there that know the science well and will create the right products that are safe for the right demand. So thank you so much for joining us on Credible Live. We'll see you next week at 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific.